Welcome again to the Haus of der Kulturen der Welt. Welcome here in this space, in the real world, but also a warm welcome to the digital world out there. I hope you are still more or less awake, even with the dark light now. We are opening today, this evening, the third chapter of Former West. The first chapter was art production, second chapter infrastructure, and today the new chapter will be Insurgent Cosmopolitanism. The starting point for this chapter is the reflection on the situation of political representation we have worldwide. We are facing a deep crisis of political representation in different countries of the world, be it China, be it the Arab world, but be it also European countries, and not only European countries in the southern European sphere, but also in the northern European sphere. For example, when we had the discussion about to which extent Germany should commit themselves in the European crisis, basically people had the impression that they were not asked in this process, that decisions were taken at places they cannot enter, they have no access to. So this is a situation where more and more political subjects feel themselves objects of a development. And this is a starting point for the speech we are going to hear right now, the speech by Ranjit Hoskote, who starts from this political analysis of this situation and tries to develop, or is going to develop, a kind of counter image, as I understand it, a kind of counter world to this, reflecting new forms of coexistence, solidarity, from a perspective of perhaps a new form of cosmopolitanism. And he is exactly the right person to do that. When he speaks about cosmopolitanism, he is a man who also lives this in many respects, traveling around the world, being in Germany, being in Europe, living in India, coming from Mumbai, but also being not only a public intellectual, but being a poet, being a curator. For example, he curated the Indian pavilion in the Venice Biennale of 2011, which was called It's About to Explode. Perhaps this could be also a starting point for the day. And his recent book is with Nancy Adayania called Atul Dodiya, the Dialogue Series. And perhaps this is a good starting point for you, Ranjit. It's great to have you.
I'm always incredibly worried when the audience is so comfortably in the dark. I have the impression that people are going to use this heaven-sent opportunity to catch up on moments of, rest. But let me begin more formally. Bernd, thank you very much for your warm and generous words of welcome. It's always a great pleasure to be back at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt. And I want to thank you and your colleagues at the Haus, and also my friend and colleague Maria Hlavajova, and all our colleagues at BAC, as well as the colleagues in the ongoing Former West process. So it gives me pleasure to open, as it were, this strand of our present Congress, which is dedicated to a rather resoundingly named topic, Insurgent Cosmopolitanism. But I want to say that I hope to embark on this in the spirit of tentativeness, of inquiry, and to try and open up a set of questions rather than really propose resolutions. So very briefly, I want to say that many of the treatments that you will hear over today and tomorrow are grounded in practices, in predicaments, in questions of poetics and problematics. And this strand is going to take the form of an extended colloquium, if you will. After I've spoken, you will hear and see Nikos Papastergiadis, who is not able to be with us. He's in Melbourne, but he will be here on screen. That will be followed by a conversation with Rasha Salti, and tomorrow there will be a discussion with Zinian Maidagan and Fisher and Elzani, and another conversation with Praneeth Soy and Alan D'Souza, and a lecture by Homi Bhabha. So that is effectively the table of contents. And I'm going to begin really by, as I said, inviting you into this inquiry on questions of citizenship. It's a five-part presentation, really. In the first, I try and unpack citizenship as it's been normalized as a social and political fact. In the second part, I reflect a little bit on what happens when these normalized assumptions of citizenship break down. I then, in the third part, look at the logic of so-called insurgent citizenship, and I dwell on some of its forms, which I characterize as assembly and mobilization. In the fourth part, I dwell a bit on what seem to me to be insufficient conceptions or conditions of citizenship. And in the fifth, I conclude by meditating on cosmopolitanism, which as we go along, you will realize is one of my fascinations and obsessions. I will try and defend it, and I hope that we will have a conversation about its possibilities or limitations as we go along. So please see this as an overture to things to come in the strand Insurgent Cosmopolitanism. The category of citizenship and the figure of the citizen have been at the center of much contemporary debate, even as despotic military regimes have been overturned by mass uprisings on the one hand, and on the other, governments technically committed to liberal and democratic forms of governance continue to expand their powers of control and surveillance, to curtail individual freedoms, to curb cultural expression and physical mobility, and to initiate or perpetuate conflicts, transnational conflicts even, that diminish the guarantees of equality, liberty, dignity, and solidarity. I would like us, in the first section of this presentation, to look more closely at the figure of the citizen, usually regarded, in the context of constitutional liberal democracy that we take as our default position, as the locus of a discourse about rights and freedoms. On this account, the citizen is usually construed as a co-signatory to a political contract. The structure of modern democracy has long been centered on a crucial relationship of delegation and representation that binds state and citizenry together. By a fundamental political contract, then, the citizenry delegate a considerable proportion of their decision-making powers to the state apparatus. In exchange for doing so, they receive a measure of representation. So if the citizenry cede a measure of agency to the state conscripts the citizens into a totalizing program of territorial belonging that is extended through various political, economic, and cultural dimensions. And we have seen historically how that is expressed through discourses like patriotism, self-sufficiency, and national identity. So the discourse of citizenship constitutes the citizen as an individual who legitimizes the state by having ceded agency and sovereignty in this way. In the same gesture, the citizen is legitimized and secured by the state. And already we discern a paradox here. If citizenship is theoretically premised on the universal application of its privileges, if citizenship is emancipatory in its effect, in practice it is conscriptive in its operations. In practice, it is territorially bounded. I suspect that this is so because the category of the citizen is a deeply contested one. It encodes a profound suspicion of the agency of the individual imagination and exalts the regulatory capacities of institutions. And at this point, I would like to revisit certain foundation myths of citizenship to explore this thought. In Plato's Republic, for instance, we may read of a formative tension a formative tension between the unruly demos, which is driven by its wants and passions, and the polis, which is proposed as the orderly and reasoned space of law, where these desires are sifted through, where value is allocated to contending needs, and a way of collective being is ruled and formulated. In another, to me at least, canonical text, Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, we read of the varied claims that are made by a heterogeneous multitudo, a multitude, which must be admitted and discussed, sorted through and sorted out, and organized into a hierarchy of evaluations of the good in the space of reasoned discussion that is the civis. So you have the demos on the one hand and the polis on the other. You have the multitudo on the one hand, the civis on the other. In both of these models, the Platonic and the Spinozist, the flow of individual agency transits from a space of ungovernable pre-civic expression to another space, which is regulated. It is the space of civic articulation. In both accounts, we may discern an account of citizenship as pedagogy. Citizenship viewed as instruction in the conduct appropriate to the individual in collective situations, or as the Greeks termed it, paideia. Through an education in such a civic paideia, the citizen as a political subject is constituted within the field of governmentality. We may now view citizenship in practice as both a conscriptive and a normative practice. It's a mode by which the individual subjectivity may be trained and normalized within a structure of authority. And that structure is attended by a protocol of obligations to institutions. It is attended also by mechanisms by which individuals grant their consent to prevailing hegemonies. And thus citizenship may be seen as a license granting the individual membership of a collective, that membership being conditional on conformity to such a structure. And so we see also a neat circularity. To perform one's citizenship is actually to exhibit competence in the imperatives of paideia. To perform one's citizenship is also to develop an amnesia towards the possibility that one might be able to recall or abrogate the privileges that have been ceded to the state. Although it strikes me, and I am admittedly being mischievous here, that the periodic ceremonial of elections preserves, as it were, symptomatically and allegorically, a hint of this possibility that one might recall or abrogate the power, the agency that one has ceded to the state. I pass now to moments where, in moments of historical crisis, when the structure of authority in a society breaks down, whether under external pressure or through the explosion of internal contradictions. The normality of citizenship as the performance of an internalized pedagogy becomes unsustainable. As the array of promised rewards and threatened penalties fail to function as usual, as the routine entitlements and opportunities, however meager or sumptuous they may have been, begin to evaporate, the political contract between citizens and state breaks down and is revealed to have been an operational fiction. That this political contract is an operational fiction is not, of course, news. We know this from a myriad everyday examples, ranging from our response to unpopular governmental decisions on taxation and social security, to the outrage we feel at the covert exercise by governments of executive powers of detention and surveillance. But rarely has this fiction been exposed as dramatically and in so extreme a manner as in the recent upheavals manifest in various theaters of discontent across the globe, including Tunisia, Egypt, Spain, the United States, and India. In each instance, whether the provocation came from popular frustration with oppressive regimes, the collapse of a neoliberal economy, or public anger at widespread corruption among ruling elites, it was evident that the citizenry had withdrawn their consent from the political contract of delegation. Significantly, though, this negative gesture doubled itself in a positive gesture of asserting the rights of the citizen to evolve new socialities, to evolve new associations, and to develop forms of representation cutting transversely across definitions laid down and sanctioned by state institutions. In effect, one might consider in many of these cases the practice of a politics without or outside or parallel to the state. It seems to me that the diverse phenomena of demonstration, protest, resistance, and upheaval that unfolded across North Africa and West Asia during 2011 are at best linked by what Wittgenstein would call a family resemblance. Although they have come to be described as a generic, if not a totalized, Arab Spring. Leaving aside the specificities of Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, and Syria for a moment, it is clear that these situations speak powerfully of the potential restoration of the citizen as a contributor to politics, rather than as a victim of policy. If we conceive of politics as a form of collective and cooperative labor, the demos has attempted, through the Arab Spring, to reclaim a significant share of the work of politics. If politics is work, then, citizens everywhere have delegated or ceded this labor to professional politicians and the apparatus of the state. The Arab Spring posed the question, was this a surrender of role in perpetuity or an indefinite lease? The time has come, as it comes cyclically, when citizens wish to reassert their ownership of the original material of sovereignty. Perhaps the 2011 upsurges in the Arab world seem novel only because we have lost the depth of historical memory. Likewise, the movements of those suddenly victimized or marginalized by the processes of vampire capital in its moment of crisis, as manifested in Occupy and its parallel movements in North America and elsewhere in the post-industrial world. The upsurge in the Arab world marks a recursion, or one might read it as such, of the anti-colonial mobilizations that swept these societies during the 1950s and the 1960s. A recovery of reserves of energy prompted by the simultaneous consolidation and vulnerability of absolutism in these societies, as well with the availability of communicative strategies that dramatize what Okwe and Weser has elsewhere called a will to globality, based not on a place of power in the world, but on a desire to belong to and contribute to the world stage. In the same spirit of annotation, I would draw a genealogical line along which the Occupy agitations could indicate a reprise of the teach-ins and other strategies of spatial and conceptual appropriation by which the left resistance, and I'm thinking of SDS and various groups and coalitions in Europe and the USA, took over the academy and other official institutions during the late 1960s, signaling the respatialization of these venues from the standpoint of an attempted utopia and the inauguration of new solidarities. Both in the Arab Spring and the Occupy scenarios, the difference that is to say with these anterior manifestations of the 60s, is that a far larger diversity of political positions is now represented within the resistance. For instance, the situation, of course, in all the countries swept up in the Arab Spring is an extremely complex one, but each involves shifting, volatile, temporary coalitions and confrontations among the moderate believer, the orthodox believer, the jihadist, the modernizer, the agnostic, and the apostate. What is at stake here is the question of who shall represent the new citizen, who is yet forming an estimate of her or his capacities. However that question is answered or resolved, it articulates a surging resistance to an absolutist conception of state power. What really did we hear in the first moment of the Arab Spring? This is a question that has haunted me. Was it the rallying call of the citizen demanding her or his proper place in the scheme of governance, her or his stake in the representation of society? Or was it rather a deeper voice released from bondage, primal enough to be at first and for a considerable while later inarticulate, the cry of what Shakespeare memorably called unaccommodated man, driven to desperation by the stripping away of all guarantees of security, dignity, and freedom, its hand forced by the inexorable machine of oppression. We heard perhaps the cry of the disenfranchised multitudo, its interests diverse, its forms of demand seemingly arbitrary, its volition, the shifting volition of a schizophrenic. We heard perhaps a voice from before the organized superscriptions of role, duty, entitlement, and conscriptive identity that are imposed by society and state. The cry, if you will, of a primal pre-civic self reclaiming and proclaiming its sovereignty, its insistence that it must stand for itself with no power above to crush it. And we heard it in an interval, a brief interval when that self devised and innovated modes of sociality and solidarity by which to form lattices of belonging and fluid resistance. This interval was too brief because it was shortly closed down by coercive forms of mobilization opposed to the status quo and standing against a compromised state and ruling class, but nonetheless all too eager with its own mechanisms of control and conscription, its own desire for the seizure of state power. These recent historical experiences hold out a proposal to us to reimagine the category of citizenship in a way that exceeds the bounds of what I have earlier called paideia, that insists on the reclaiming of agency by the citizen, that emphasizes the reactivation of the citizen as a contributor to political processes rather than as a victim or a recipient of legislation. The inspiration for such a reimagining of citizenship emerges from a theater of urgency far removed from the regulatory armature of the polis or the civis. I speak here of the theater of insurgency and would ask whether we can bring together into the same conceptual space of social being and political action two such opposed figures as the citizen and the insurgent. Normally, and as I use that word, I'm aware of how it indicates actually a consensual notion of what is normal. The insurgent incarnates a disruption of the workings of the state, a sabotage of authority, a production of chaos and deficit. If the insurgent has been romanticized as the embodiment of revolution, he or she has also been stigmatized as the embodiment of instability. The insurgent is the one who has refused to submit to paideia, who denies and negates the pedagogy of citizenship. In a juridical narrative, the insurgent has broken the political contract with the state. In terms of social psychology, the insurgent is the stranger, one who has chosen to estrange herself or himself from the interests of the collective formation. However, and here I follow the anthropologist James Holston, who has developed the notion of the insurgent citizen in the context of marginalized urban populations in Brazil, what if we were to imagine the insurgent as the bearer of a renovated and amplified responsibility? Holston's work has to do with how citizens in these disenfranchised contexts in the global South reclaim agency over their relationships, their neighborhoods, and their vital infrastructure. What if, building from this, we could imagine the insurgent as a catalytic figure representing the productive labor of improvisation and experimentation that is involved in addressing the deficits and also exploring the advantages left behind by a failed state, a broken political contract, and exposed and discredited paideia. In the next section, I want to put out a caveat. If I have seemed so far to celebrate the renovatory potentialities of insurgent citizenship, indulge me now as I sketch an opposite and cautionary scenario concerning the revolutionary consciousness of insurgent citizenship and the consequences this might bring into play. In replacing the discredited structure of authority and protocols of paideia, an insurgent citizenry would necessarily evolve improvisational, heuristically tuned, tactically flexible forms of association and collaboration and governance. For a moment, I find myself envisaging here new forms of gathering and experimental forms of community such as those that might have inhabited Yonah Friedman's mobile architecture, grafted interstitially and adversarially to an existing but exhausted and unresponsive urban infrastructure. However, while solidarity may well be an ideal for some of these forms of gathering, I'm thinking here of effectively a power vacuum in which insurgent citizenry produces these different forms of association and collaboration. Solidarity is certainly one of the ideals for these gatherings, but what is more likely, and here I admit to a strain of pessimism, is that assemblies of this heterogeneous and tentative nature may well be marginalized by more forceful, demagogic, and militant forms of collectivity, to which here I assign the name of mobilization. Nomen est omen. Carrying within itself the dynamic of organized movement, the mobilization tends towards the replication of the structures it overthrew, replete with an ability and willingness to deploy resources strategically and to produce a new order in an antagonistic, non-consultative mode. So I'm suggesting that one of the outcomes of a situation where a society is passing into the hands, if you will, of an insurgent citizenry is that you might have a confrontation between the form that I call the assembly and the form that I call the mobilization. The effect of this eclipse of assembly by mobilization, as the logic of insurgent citizenship elaborates itself, is to foreclose the options that were only just opening up before a nascent public sphere. That nascent public sphere becomes striated by the confrontations among these forms and among various species of mobilization. Differences of viewpoint, each of these articulating a group good or a skewed notion of the greater common good, become sharpened to the point of irreconcilability, and a general tendency towards a mutually annihilatory attitude manifests itself. The resolution of the scenario of conflict and uncertainty, as we have seen very often, is effected by the triumph of the most resolutely ruthless and best organized of the mobilizations, which establishes its template then for a new, typically homogeneous society attended by a refusal to countenance difference or dissidence. By way of example, and the examples unfortunately are very many, I would like to choose the unfolding dynamic of the two phases of the Iranian Revolution of 1978-1979. I do this also since it permits me to open up the genealogy of the former West project somewhat by shifting the baseline from 1989 to a decade or so earlier to look at other or alternative trajectories of crisis which then were to culminate in the decades to come. In the first 1978 phase of the Iranian Revolution, many of you will be familiar with these narratives, but bear with me while I schematize them. In the first 1978 phase of the revolution, the insurgent citizenry rising against the Shah's monarchy comprised a mixed set of constituencies, including students, the traditional merchant class, elements of the liberal westernized bourgeoisie, and leftist factions, among others. They formed a loose assembly broadly committed to a constitutional and democratic orientation. The figure who inspired many of them was the political thinker and sociologist Ali Shariati, who was committed to the project of defining a liberal Islamic modernity through the exercise of criticality, annotation, commentary, and debate. But by the second 1979 phase of the Iranian Revolution, which is the only phase that seems to have secreted itself in public memory generally, the uprising against the Shah had been read and represented in more singularized, specifically theological terms. The efforts of the insurgent citizenry were to be sanctified within the parameters of a religious revolution, a restatement of Islamic values against a regime that had sought to impose Western and secular values on the country, while also dispossessing, disenfranchising, and oppressing large segments of the population. The figure who inspired this latter and decisive phase of the revolution was Imam Khomeini, who acted on a theory of government that departed from the Shia tradition of quietism among theologians. Khomeini, as many of you will recall, instituted the Wilaya-i-Faqih, the infallible mandate of the jurist, as the legitimating basis of the power of the new state. Note that both phases of the revolution were marked by resistance to a despotic regime. Note also that both phases of the revolution were premised, although differentially, on the recognition and even valorization of an insurgent citizenry, and that they both looked forward, although in remarkably different registers, to an alternative and locally orientated modernity. Because for some reason, at least rhetorically and then in practice, many of us tend to dismiss the 1979 phase as somehow a return to the Middle Ages. I have never quite understood this journalistic locution because it doesn't correspond to anything historically. If anything, this was a wager, although we might not respond to it, on a certain kind of modernity. And yet, in 1978, which I shall designate as the moment of assembly, the possibilities for a public sphere were genuinely open. The insurgent citizen was still meaningful as a locus of agency, the ground for mutual understanding and accommodation among disparate groups was still available. By contrast, in 1979, which I shall designate as the moment of mobilization, this apertural public space was taken over and over-inscribed by a revolutionary vanguard class, which instrumentalized the insurgent citizenry into a society that was mobilized, that was encouraged by the syndromes of resentment, paranoia, and the seeking of a historic vengeance as justice. And what we saw unfold, of course, was that the paideia of the Shah's monarchy, if you will, was soon replaced by an equally conscriptive education in the rhetoric, reflexes, and political and cultural practices of a messianic revolutionary consciousness. In the spirit of a caveat, then, it seems to me that in diagnosing the outcomes of what an activated insurgent citizenry is able to achieve, we must sidestep our own desire to romanticize the figure of the insurgent citizen. And we must regard judiciously the effects of the moment of assembly against those of the moment of mobilization. If the assembly keeps open the logic of emancipation, the mobilization reproduces the limiting structures of control, repression, and conditioning that it had originally opposed, although it employs different vocabularies and ideological justifications. I come now to the fourth part, where I would like to carry this reflection on the assembly and the mobilization to a brief meditation on certain persuasive and even compelling models of citizenship that have now begun to emerge, whether in many societies in the global south, or indeed, as Bernd indicated in his opening remarks, also in parts of the embattled and beleaguered global north. And I call them models of citizenship, but it's probably more accurate to describe them as models of quasi-citizenship, or models of social participation and political belonging. Some of these models carry within them the atavistic, spectral presence of old ethno-nationalisms. Others register a suspicion of the physical mobility of people, the digital circulations of ideas, and the unpredictable encounters among dissimilar entities that globalization has generated. Yet others attempt, reclaiming a discredited and slightly sinister identity politics, to profit from the confrontation between what Zygmunt Bauman has characterized as the liquid modernity of late capital, which dissolves the certitudes of identity, location, and selfhood, and on the other hand, the neo-tribalism, as he terms it, that it provokes among embattled communities who seek perches in a world of fleeting commodities and entrenched illusions. Most of these flawed models of quasi-citizenship, and I'm thinking here of the kind of model that is proposed, say, by the exponents of militant Hindu nationalism in India, or the parties of the far right in many European countries, or by the forces of global jihad in the name of a retrieved ummah, or world community of believers. When we look at these models of citizenship, all of them are in fact inspired by the moment of mobilization, which is seductive in its promise of controlling the vicissitudes of the world. In many societies, individuals and communities must situate and historicize themselves and struggle with the contradictions of this kind of citizenship. They must weigh the emancipatory potential of a universal citizenship against its conscriptive actuality. They must compare the consolations of paideia to the hazards of an insurgent reclamation. And always they must address the central paradox of this situation, namely, that the concept of citizenship, which is premised on a capacious and enabling notion of universality, must always be articulated in limited, limiting, partial terms. I think there is space here for a certain meditation on the finitude of what we can achieve in terms of social participation and political belonging. So whilst theoretically we are committed to a universal notion of citizenship, it seems always, for whatever reason, to be achieved in extremely limited ways. If cast in these terms, it would appear that every form of conventional or recently innovated citizenship, whether conscriptive or insurgent, is insufficiently universal. It stands based on the logic of the mobilization. It stands contoured within a constraining limitation within the grounds of identity, preordained common purpose, and a measure of familiarity among the participants in such a project. At its grandest scale, the nation-state is certainly always a latent mobilization. And in times of actual military mobilization, we see how, in fact, the citizenry is regarded by strategists as a reserve army of some kind, and that is a deeply terrifying prospect. At the more intimate scale of the neighborhood also, even the Holstonian notion of insurgent citizenship, although greatly admirable in itself, appears limited. Its applications seem remedial or therapeutic, tuned to the ultimately mappable paradigm of a neighborhood or a cityscape. So I find myself asking, what level or degree of universality can such models of citizenship afford us in an increasingly complex world where we follow the lines of curiosity into terrains with which we have no historical linkages? In a world where we must feel, think, and act out idioms of mutuality in unforeseen spaces of encounter. In a world, again, where we form temporary communities by recovering lost historical entanglements from histories of trade, or a world in which we renounce the more obvious cultural exchanges and bypass the more obvious contact zones demarcated for us by histories of colonialism and empire. This is a world in which we must address the others we find ourselves hosting, or gaze critically at the others that we ourselves become when we are at large in the many wares of this planet. A life lived in such limit-transgressive conditions requires us to rethink the questions of belonging by thinking, among others, of the figures of the guest and the host, the stranger and the migrant, the translator and the contributor. In other words, by thinking of the other who makes a claim on the self's attention, towards whom the self reaches in gestures of attraction, bafflement, neighborliness, or recognition, and who, importantly, contributes economic, cultural, and political labor to the habitat occupied by the self. I turn, as I speak, from the trope of mobilization to the trope of assembly, that collage of dissimilars where affinities may be explored, the liminality of subjectives transiting from one stage to another articulated, and where the phraseology of dialogue may be devised. The trope of assembly, with its emphasis on receptivity and the collaboration of unforeseen actors, leads me to consider a more expanded, admittedly utopian conception of citizenship, one in which we shift the accent away from identity, preordained common purpose, and familiarity, and where we move the accent toward an inquiry into differential positions, diverse purposes, and the measure of strangeness. I speak now of cosmopolitanism. And in the closing section, what I want to try and do is to tease out some of its meanings and craft, if you will, a provisional genealogy for it. And let me make plain that I'm not speaking here of cosmopolitanism in its loose, popularly understood sense, because all too often, almost as a trick of language, we tend to see cosmopolitanism as a settled attitude of world citizenship, typically based on an ease of passage from one society and culture to another. But that kind of ease is premised on manifest economic and political privilege and more elided biographical reserves of cultivation, taste, and cultural capital. I do not, in fact, regard cosmopolitanism as a worldview that assumes such an unproblematic world citizenship to exist, always somewhere behind the barricades of nationalist or nativist ideology, from where it can be recovered by an act of choice. What I would prefer to do is to explore the idea, precept, and practice of the cosmopolitan in the register of what I shall, following the historian of science, Isabel Stengers, denote as a cosmopolitics. In a sense, it's a move from the noun-heavy notion of cosmopolitanism to a more verb-oriented understanding of cosmopolitics. Now, this is not only an active engagement with difference or with that which is different, but it is also a confrontation of oneself in the face of difference, of the effect of one's own epistemological and axiological practices on the other. It strikes me that, somewhat didactic as such a maneuver may well appear, I might usefully draw now on the tradition of the cosmopolitan imagination to craft this provisional genealogy that I referred to earlier. And I'd begin, everything seems to go back to the ancient Greeks, but it's still a worthwhile enterprise to go back and retrieve from that source. So I would like to begin with the 5th century philosopher Diogenes, who, when asked to name his place of origin and allegiance, and this is a well-known story, replied, "I am a citizen of the world," cosmopolites. In his own historical context, this marked a radical and anarchistic break with the prescribed identity based on citizenship of one or another Greek city-state, or by membership of the Greek mythic and linguistic ethos. The Stoics took this diogenetic attitude forward, and as Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, interprets their position, they argued that all of us as individuals frame our lives in two communities. On the one hand, one's birth or local community, and on the other, and I quote her, the community of human argument and aspiration. And it is this latter frame of belonging that I would like to focus on. I would like to dwell a little more on the inspiring philosophical explorations of the Stoics. Their key term for the formation of connections between the self and the world was oikeiosis, which is often translated as affinity, but if you dwell on the etymology, you will find that oikeiosis points us towards a making at home, if not a making home, and enhoming, if you will, of the world. Later Stoics, Zeno, Heracles, envisioned the individual as living in a world formed by a series of concentric circles. The nearest were the circles of family and home, the region was set further, the rest of the world was set furthest away. The practice of oikeiosis was intended to reduce the distance between the nearest and the furthest circles by releasing oneself through responsibility towards those inhabiting the furthest circles. And so oikeiosis is seen as a mode of dissolving distance into proximity and bringing the interests of self and other into contiguity, if not consonance. And thus oikeiosis becomes the basis for the potential cultivation of relationships of trust, collaboration, equity, dignity, and justice. I vault many centuries now to address, too briefly, the work of the 20th century philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who has, for all kinds of reasons, been a particularly important presence for me. And I would dwell a little on his account of the relationship between self and other, and would draft that into this conception of the cosmopolitan that I'm exploring here. For Levinas, the crucial and defining moment of the construction of the self is its encounter with the other, an encounter that marks both physical proximity and illimitable distance, vibrant affinity, and radical alterity. In that moment also, Levinas argues, we recognize the vulnerability of the other, and in response, a responsibility towards the vulnerable other is summoned forth from us. Indeed, Levinas argued that subjectivity is founded precisely on our capacity for being with the other, which subjects our sovereign selfhood to an ethical awareness outside ourselves. It orients our sense of self and gives it a significance beyond the conditions of narcissism and object cathexis. More recently, the philosopher and cultural theorist Kwame Anthony Appiah, in his 2006 book, which many of you will know, Ethics in a World of Strangers, has argued for a cosmopolitanism that balances between a respect for universal values and a respect for cultural difference. For Appiah, the limits to this balance are set when a culture-specific practice contravenes a universal value, in which case, of course, the universal value would prevail. So, in Appiah's account, cultural difference is not fetishized into an absolute value, and universal values are not relativized away into dilution and irrelevance. Now, on the one hand, this seems a most reasonable account. Unhappily, it can easily be subverted and absorbed within a neo-imperial ideology that justifies invasion and occupation in the cause of protecting universal values against culture-specific practices that seem to run contrary to them. Appiah's approach might be described as a liberal cosmopolitanism. I would attend closely also to more radical conceptions of the cosmopolitanism, and that is where the title of the strand comes from. I'm thinking here of de Souza Santos's insurgent cosmopolitanism, a term he uses to refer to the formation of transnational counter-hegemonic coalitions among a wide array of actors, including activists, students, trade unionists, academics, and others, as a counterposition to the transnational alliances that exist among the geographically distributed elites of global capital. Santos's insurgent cosmopolitanism is distinct from liberal cosmopolitanism in several ways. For one, it insists that we include the experiences, theories, and indeed the alternative modernities of the societies of the global South in our narrative of the cosmopolitan imagination. For another, it is premised on resistance and tends to democratize the transnational and social and political initiatives that it's involved in by opposing hegemony, confronting asymmetry, and extending an empathetic understanding towards diverse locales of struggle and conflict. Such an insurgent cosmopolitanism, precisely by resisting the dynamic of mobilization and operating as assembly, would also retain the capacity to interrogate its own differentials of class, gender, ethnicity, race, and location. And I'm going to conclude now by suggesting that in this kind of characterization of a cosmopolitan imagination that's premised on resistance, on the inclusion of other kinds of historical experience, we have moved a considerable distance from the settled notion of cosmopolitanism as personal accomplishment. We've moved away also from the delicate balance of liberal cosmopolitanism. Instead, we may now see cosmopolitanism as a continuous work in progress. Indeed, I'd like to think that there has always been implicit within a certain kind of cosmopolitan imagination the awareness that it is in fact an act of cultural, intellectual, artistic, and political labor. And I want to stress that category of labor because it involves constant responsiveness to the predicament of the other, as well as constant self-criticality towards one's own methods, practices, assumptions, and institutions. Through such an account, we can frame and address the engagement of cultural producers with political and cultural predicaments in locations not their own, such as many of the artists and writers who we will be engaging with over the next 2 days. On this reading, cosmopolitanism is a strategy that sets itself against the grain of sedimented attitudes and works with the textures of particular situations while retaining the ability to imagine what art theorist Nikos Papastergiadis describes as, and I quote, a new model of coexistence in which rival claims could negotiate their local or regional differences without being confounded, leading us to the question, what is it to be human without any formal or fixed markers of identity, end of quote. Within this preoccupation, we may also observe the continuing presence of a revolutionary, even utopian hope of achieving solidarity among protagonists across predicaments through the act of identifying affinity, shared criticality, and collaboratively achieved affirmation. I'll end by pointing at, in the practices of a number of cultural producers today, towards those lines of inquiry born of curiosity, those tropisms towards the vulnerability of another, those releasements of self towards other that reject the frameworks of ethnography. If these practices are inspired by what I have elsewhere, in fact also at the Hakave, termed transformative listening to the ungovernable, unpredictable voice of the other, they are also predicated on the hope that we can collaborate on a language in which to phrase communicative engagement. In these practices, we find the self dismantling all of the musealized temporalities it contains and which define it. We find the self opening out towards a hope of solidarity and a wager on a future that is not held hostage by the phantoms of past conscriptions and mobilizations. Thank you for your patience and your attentiveness.
3-4 questions. Thank you very much, Ranjit, for his really inspiring reflections on citizenship and cosmopolitanism. We have about 10 minutes for taking some questions. Do we have mics? Where? So, oh yeah, there are mics. Okay, there's a mic and there's a mic. Are there any questions? Remarks? We wait 1 minute for reflection. Yeah, perhaps you could go up to a mic. There are mics over there. Sorry for this discomfort. So whoever has a question may stand behind the mic already. Please.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I think I understand the distinction, the conceptual distinction between assembly and mobilization, but why did you choose such words, assembly and mobilization? I can understand the example with the Iranian Revolution, but why such words? Assembly, mobilization.
Yeah, just try it. If not, you can take that one.
This is working? Yeah. Well, these are categories that I've actually been working with in recent writing. And it seems to me that the notion of the assembly keeps alive the idea, if you will, of a collage, a polyphony, a space where dissimilars can come together and essentially where major questions, if you will, can be debated and collaborative responses found. And mobilization seems to me to always be directed by a certain kind of notion of being a vanguard, of forcing through certain conclusions and forcing through, if you will, new directions for a particular society. It just seems to me that assembly has much more the impulse of democratic volition, if you like, while mobilization, even within its name, suggests military deployment, if you will, a command structure. So it seems to me that within the structure of, or the logic of revolutionary action, you always have these two phases. And hence these names applied to them with all of the associations that they bear. I wonder if that responds to what you have to say.
Okay, yeah, my question is actually around those terms also. And I think I sympathize with your, let's say, privileging one over the other. But on the other hand, I think that there's not only a temporal aspect or a temporal connection between them, but also a structural one. And perhaps it's very difficult to disentangle them apart from, let's say, in a theoretical argument. So my question is fairly simple, which is it possible to imagine revolution without mobilization?
It's very difficult. I think what is possible is if this were a specific historical account, one would, of course, look at the complexities with which the coexistence of these forms, it informs the momentum of any revolution. I'm not at all sure that revolutions can be achieved without a degree of mobilization, but what I would hold on to is the possibility that we can subject the mobilization to a kind of critique. But mobilizations tend to move so fast that the space for this kind of ethical critique is greatly diminished. So, which is why I speak under the sign of the caveat. Does that answer your question, sir?
Okay, last question.
Thanks, Ranjit. I wonder if you can address question of desire. And I'm thinking here particularly desires around greed and self-interest, and the greater attachment to those in terms of their power to, I guess, draw us towards asserting a dominating self rather than having to negotiate a destabilized one where we negotiate our common interests with the other. So, the point at which that revolution actually, as you said, gets taken over by whoever's in the most powerful position to assert a dominating self. So, and I think that sort of, what's our interest in actually negotiating a destabilized self as opposed to seizing power where we can be dominant?
I wonder if we're actually looking at two completely different and not scientifically sustainable views of human nature, or certainly of of what motivates and inspires social behavior.
Devil's advocate here, but simple question: why should we do it?
Perhaps because our interests are so interdependent with those of others, increasingly so, that there might be situations where securing one's own narrow self-interest is actually not the most selfish thing you might do. That there might be grounds for reciprocity and altruism to actually be the best ways of extending one's own interests. If we are taking a view of human nature that is based on self-interest, sometimes it seems to me that acts of voluntary subjection to the other, acts of reaching out to the predicament or crisis of the other might well be the best way of realizing or resolving questions that we ourselves have. And I hope that this is what we're going to be discussing as we go along through the modes of diaspora, displacement, and so forth. I'm not going to preempt what we're all going to discuss shortly. But does that go some way towards responding to what you had to ask?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, it was a brilliant elucidation of these questions of cosmopolitanism. And of course, yes, we will discuss this more. But it's like that question of, art should be good for us. But there's still that nagging doubt of why should it be good for us? Why should we do it?
Okay.
To be continued.
I think to have a question at the end is wonderful. And thank you very much. And now we go on with the program. And Ranjit, you may introduce the next part. think to have a question at the end is wonderful. And thank you very much. And now we go on with the program. And Ranjit, you may introduce the next part.
Nikos Papastergiadis was invoked in my presentation, and what we will now see and hear is Nikos' own reflection on an art critic and novelist whose work has had great resonance for many of us, John Berger. And I quote from what Nikos writes here. This lecture traces the imaginative swerve in Berger's writing that touches on such fundamental polarities as home and exile, connection and displacement, and violation and redemption, in order to consider his enduring fascination with the artist's capacity to both see this world and to create others. So in Nikos' meditation, we move very much towards questions that animate and vex artistic practice and its connection to other social and cultural practices. So.
Greetings, friends and colleagues from Berlin. I'm sorry that I can't join you to be a part of this very important and very interesting event in Berlin. And my deep thanks for the invitation, in particular to Ranjit, and to my other friends who are there. Hello from sunny Melbourne. As a way of speaking to the key theme of this conference, I'm going to pick up three key terms that were central to the old left. The terms of truth, solidarity and justice. And I want to see how these terms are still resonant today, or in what ways they've shifted. And I want to see how the word like truth, the attempt to try and see things as they are and not through some distorted lens that serves other hierarchies, or the idea of solidarity and how it's changed towards thinking about interconnectedness and equality amongst all, and the kind of equality and connectedness that produces a sense of unity but not at the expense of identity, and a sense of justice and how this is now pursued in terms of the balancing requirements with others and with the world as a whole, and the capacity to live a kind of virtuous life in contemporary forms. Now these key terms that were central to the left, I believe, also contained within a certain approach to the world. The first, the pursuit of truth, was a kind of revelatory approach. The second, this idea of equality and interconnectedness, was a connective approach, a sort of projective, an outward thing. And the third one is a sort of what I call a harmonics, a mode of being and living in the world. Now the understanding of these key terms and approaches in the past, in the post-war period in particular, was predominantly pursued through the categories of ethics and politics. Even in art criticism, the way in which we understood those terms was primarily through those two categories. Now my concern today is to sort of try and balance this, not to challenge or contradict the validity or necessity of those approaches, but rather to balance this with a more direct examination of how such terms and approaches can also be understood through the category of aesthetics. In particular, I'll be focusing on the writing of John Berger. John Berger, for those who don't know, is a critic living in France today. He's also an artist, a writer, a novelist, a poet, a playwright, a drawer, a painter, a polymath in many ways. He had his formative experiences during the Second World War, I would argue, where he served in the army, and then afterwards went to art school, became a painter and a critic. He was very much influenced by artists and scholars and philosophers and activists who had left Europe and settled in London in the 50s and 40s. John's first book was A Painter of Our Times, It's a portrait of a painter, an emigre from the former Soviet bloc country of Hungary, and his attempt to reconcile his own political and artistic ambitions. Throughout that period of time, John also became a regular art critic for the New Statesman and New Society. Some of his more influential essays appeared in a book called Permanent Red. He was also very famously known for a portrait of a Russian artist, Ernst Neizvestny, and the role of the artist in the Soviet Union, Art and Revolution. One of his most influential books and popular books was the critical book on Pablo Picasso, again exploring the relationship that an artist can have with the politics of his epoch. So here was an author, a writer, who was very much involved with the Marxist critiques of his time, who was in a sense a strong Marxist, although never a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And what I want to explore in this lecture is the subtle and significant shift of focus in his art criticism. From this period in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when the focus of his art criticism was to speculate on the social and political consequences of art, to the 90s and the last 2 decades, where there's been more of a reflection on the aesthetic process of creation and its articulation of a cosmos. Through this examination, I want to see how the understanding of these 3 key terms of truth, solidarity and justice, and these approaches, the approaches of revelation, connection and harmony, can also be re-understood and be given a different kind of flesh when they're seen through the aesthetic categories. In particular, I want to stress something that's very important, and that is, while John Berger's work, in a sense, can be seen as having shifted from a more empirical and political approach, in other words, how art has tried to produce changes in the world, to one that it can be seen as more metaphysical and aesthetic, and that is more concerned with the aesthetic processes, this itself, I want to emphasize, is not a regression. Preference of a kind of obscurantism over an engagement with the real. In fact, nothing could be more repellent for someone like John. What I think is happening is not a movement away from reality, but an attempt to get closer to it and become more clear about what actually happens when art is making its own world. To illustrate this point, this broad thesis that I'm trying to make, let's start with a recent review by John on Cézanne. The essay is entitled by a fabulous quotation from Cézanne, which is, "Colour is the place where our brain and the universe meet." Now, before going into some celestial speculation that this title kind of incites and provokes, let's reflect on how Berger himself charts the movement in Cézanne's work. He takes us through a movement from the revelation of the sensuous and sensory corporeality in which the human body is bound to a sensation of another corporeality that opens itself to an all-pervasive landscape. Here, Berger is drawing our attention to the connection between the perception of worldly impressions and the consciousness of an emergent form that opens itself to seeing how all works of art are to some extent a creation of the world. He gives us a glimpse of this via the concept of the black box that lurks in the painting. In a way, this is symptomatic and typical of Berger's approach to writing. He takes us into the particular, and then to the general, into the local and the cosmic, and he simultaneously compresses the two together and makes them feel they're coming out of your own body, coming out of your own aspirations and thoughts. And what is interesting to me is how he has not just got this gift for communication and relation, but his capacity to track certain developments which are key at our particular point in time. Developments in the way in which we pursue these terms that I've begun with. And so what I will try and do from this point on in this lecture is show us how the act of imagination is connected to these ideas of truth, solidarity, and justice, and how John's writing, in a sense, provides us one pathway for following our pursuit of these broader concepts and ideals. Now, in a sense, throughout all of Berger's writing, the pursuit of the processes of aesthetic imagination are key. Of course, that would be typical of an art critic. And therefore, it would be useful for all of us to start with some kind of definition of what we mean by the faculty of imagination. Someone who I admire greatly, and I'm sure is central to also Berger's thinking, is the great Gaston Bachelard. In this wonderful book, Bachelard also gives us a very neat and simple definition of imagination. He says, this is the faculty for producing new images. Not for recalling images from other places or from the past, because of course that's the act of memory, but for the production of new and novel images. Now, these images obviously incorporate elements from the past, they include details from elsewhere, but it's the way in which they are rearranged that of course is distinctive, that produces something new. In a sense, Berger's criticism has also followed this relationship to the past and the future, and what he in a very sort of mercurial way defines as a kind of nostalgia for the future. This is one of his definitions for the way in which imagination and memory are connected. Now, in the 50s, Berger was a kind of outspoken critic, one who was an advocate of certain kinds of social realism. He was not that patient with the emphasis given to formalist approaches in art. He was more directive towards the Marxist approaches towards art. But I would argue that even in that more strident and more combative strain of his writing, there was still a close attention to the relationship between creativity and what I call as cosmology. This is certainly something that has become more vivid in his more recent essays that are collected in books like this one, The Shape of a Pocket, or in more recent essay like Here Is Where We Meet, and a wonderful collection called Hold Everything Dear. I'll come back to these three collections throughout this essay and throughout this lecture, but let me just begin now by talking more briefly and more broadly by how John Berger's work can add a little bit more to our understanding of what we mean by aesthetic imagination, how it's related to the notion of history and the past and politics and our place, and how, in fact, it is connected to this struggle to articulate a truth about our times. Now, for Berger, this status of a truth claim is not the same as the way in which we talk when we talk about truth claims in terms of legal definitions and sort of juridical debates over what can be defined as true or false. It is not an empirical and purely rational account of truth. It's something that's far more complex and ambiguous, and it arises not just by the criteria, and it's not just established by the criteria for validation, but it's through emergence and how it arises, in other words, through our sensory faculties, and then how that sensory awareness of things is then cross-checked with more procedural elements of reasoned thought practices. So this understanding of truth in art is, I would argue, one that requires a sort of different approach, one that is also coming out of one's sensory awareness of the world and not just one that's confined to these reasoned processes for validation and verification. And in that way, we can see how the truth claims are also fundamentally connected to this idea of the production of new images that come into the world through our sensory awareness of the world, and which in itself is an articulation of a world. Now, again, let me say, like I said, let's step back to these earlier period when John was writing his famous essays for The Statesman and the New Society and for various other left-wing magazines around London. During that period, he defined his stance in rather combative and critical terms. He was, in a sense, seeing himself as an advocate for and a spokesperson for various kinds of movements and artists who were engaged with certain politics about confronting oppression and wanting to expand our awareness of our potential and having to expose the falsities and illusions and distortions and oppressions that were dominating both cultural and political life. Now, he was very conscious of that combative stance, and he wouldn't shirk away from the necessity for that position and that the necessity for that struggle and need to confront, but rather what one sees now is not just this need to expose and reveal the truth, but also an emphasis on how we create a truth. In that sense, that shift from that period to the period where I'm talking about now in the last 10 or 15 years, we see a shift towards a creative and more fabulative or poetic kind of writing. And of course, we can align this shift to writers like Michael Tausig, Bruno Latour, and various other writers who are more conscious of the way in which the writing process is not just a revelatory activity, but also a creative and emergent practice. And in that sense, we can see how he shifted from thinking about how he needed to enter the field, this is Bersia, to find a detail that reveals the different kinds of relationships that exist in a field, to a kind of more mysterious and magical kind of process by which something emerges from possibilities that arise from certain situations. So that emergent possibility, rather than that revelatory tendency, is something that I want to focus on, and how in that emergent possibility we create a certain order, produce a certain kind of arrangement. And to quote one of the Chinese painters that appear in one of these essays, it is to save things from chaos. Now, in a sense, what I've been arguing is that while the earlier writing in its tone was more strident and more combative, it was also, from the beginning, it was also still implicitly, if not always explicitly, interested in this creative process. And this, I think, has been something that has been overlooked in the way in which we reflect on his earlier writings and in those famous series of TV programs that he made with a number of people called Ways of Seeing. This was a very influential series of TV programs that, of course, resulted in the famous book, which every undergraduate, and I was one of them, who experienced this and in many ways started anew in my critical thinking. And but through this series, we also see how Ways of Seeing is not just unseeing the conventional things, but also refers to a broader way of being in the world. It refers to a kind of wider scope and a wider frame. And it combines both a terrestrial and, I would argue, celestial perspective on seeing. Now, this becomes more explicit in the essays that appear in this wonderful book, The Shape of a Pocket. Let me just give you an indication of some of these changes that appear in his writing. He says at one point, our customary visible order is not the only one. It coexists with other orders, stories of fairies, sprites, ogres. These were all human attempts to come to terms with their coexistence. Hunters are continually aware of it and can read signs we do not see. Children feel it intuitively because they have the habit of hiding behind things. There they discover the interstices between different sets of the visible. This idea of discovering the interstices between the different sets of the visible, which is a key theme in his current writing, of course was already there 30 years earlier, more than 30 years earlier, in the ways of seeing. And so I'm trying to make an explicit connection between his fundamental questions about how we see and our ability to find things that are otherwise hidden from us. And to highlight this point, I want to also take us to a very, very important passage in an equally meditative book which appeared much earlier in 1984, which is called And Our Faces as Brief as Photos. And Our Faces, My Heart, Brief as Photos. This includes a very important passage about the ontology of being and how our sense of our origin is also a creation story. The story of where we come from and how we're related to a particular place is also a platform for establishing our way of being in the world as a whole. It doesn't just confine us to a particular point, but it opens us up to being part of the world. And in that passage where he talks about the significance of home and he relates the findings of the great Romanian anthropologist Bersia Eliade, he also talks about home not just as a center of the real, but as this place for assembling the fragments and experiences of the world in order to open up paths for entering the world and creating broader senses of self-understanding. In this sense, he's not simply trying to validate traditional wisdom against contemporary kinds of alienation, but rather he's saying that this process of self-understanding that was implicit and explicit in the mythological construction of the world is something that is still persistent and is still relevant to the ways in which we can understand the creative process as a whole. And this idea in terms of creation as a way of self-understanding and self-exploration through connection between the particular and the whole is also appearing over and over again in the essays that I've just referred to in the collection Hold Everything Dear, which of course is a line from a Welsh poet. And in this collection there is a wonderful little passage which I'll read as a whole. A small brass bowl called a fear cup, engraved with filigree geometric patterns and some verses from the Quran arranged in the form of a flower. Fill it with water and leave it outside under the stars for a night. Then drink the water whilst praying that it will alleviate the pain and cure you. For many sicknesses, the fear cup is clearly less effective than a course of antibiotics. But a bowl of water which has reflected the time of the stars, the same water from which everything living thing was made, as is said in the Quran, may help resist the stranglehold. Now, in this very astute and brief passage, a number of things are being brought to our attention. Obviously, Berger doesn't take the complete story that it saves us, this fear cup, that it can save us from everything, and that he, at certain points, would rather be cured by antibiotics than by faith. Science is not irrelevant in this story. However, what he is referring to is how we can be addressing the sense of the stranglehold of helplessness, insignificance and solitude. That stranglehold, he argues, can only be redeemed not by scientific, but by a kind of mythological or cosmological understanding of our relationship to the world as a whole and the cosmos. So in that sense, the water becomes a conductor, a medium for a sense of companionship, and it becomes a principle through which we can create the world anew. So the key first point, in a sense, that comes out of this story of creation is this need for companionship, a sense of breaking down the barriers of isolation and connection and finding new connections and giving form to the possibility of that kind of connected worldview. So one of the starting points for Berger's understanding of creation comes from this desire for companionship. Now, we talk a lot about the issues of globalization and how it's produced a kind of stronger sense of interconnectedness. This kind of companionship that I think that is being intimated in this text is not just this companionship of ourselves in the world in the terrestrial sense, but it's something wider, something more celestial, and therefore I'm stressing the cosmological dimensions of the notion of creation and companionship. And ironically, while I've just mentioned the term globalization, in the same collection there are two other essays, one on Edouard Glissant and the other one on Dickinson and Spinoza, which also talk about the fighting and struggle of resistance and oppressions in this colonized world, and how they are also expressive of a desire to create a world anew. Now, this idea that I'm stressing of companionship, I think, takes us more fundamentally not to the mysteries of creation and origin, but rather not to that traditional sense of artist as autogenesis that the more romantically oriented and more surrealistly inspired critics like Herbert Reed and Kenneth Clark talked about at the same time as Berger in the 60s and 70s, but rather they take us more to something more banal perhaps, to the idea of being with others, and through this idea of collaboration, how you receive signs from the world as a whole and your relationship with others, how the artist in a sense is a beneficiary of the reception of these signs, and how the creative process is the struggle and the ability to give form to that which is received. So from this idea of companionship, I now want to stress the concept of collaboration, and how the idea of collaboration and then how the idea of place is also evoked in Berger's writing. First of all, let me stress that the principle of collaboration in Berger's writing is not an instrumental kind of notion of collaboration where you utilize the experience of other people to help you advance your own cause. Rather, it is a principle of equality and sharing and activation of all the elements and all the parties and all the agents in the process. Everyone, in the sense, in the process of participating is in the act of giving, and that through this process of collaboration there is a steady and subtle form of recognition that occurs through the practice of transformation. This again borders on the mystical, and there is a lot of theological debates, especially amongst the ancient Greeks, around the idea of kenosis, how the emptying of the self achieves this higher state of transformation, how it opens itself up for the reception of a higher principle or a higher body, and therefore utterly overtakes the subject and enables a union with the divine. Now, in a sense, that kind of procedure is not fundamentally different to what Berger is talking about, but it is not towards this union with the divine, but rather that it is through this encounter with the other that produces both a transformation in one's own identity and an acceptance of the need for recognition by the other. And in that exchange between the desire for your own reception of the other and their need for recognition, something wonderful happens in that oscillation that enables both to mutually be overtaken. Both the subject and the object, both the artist and the sitter in the story of drawing, for instance, are transformed in the encounter. And Berger has unpacked this process of collaboration in great detail, often in correspondences with artists. He's a prolific writer of letters, and often these letters are published. And a wonderful exchange between the artist Leon Kossuth and John Berger also appears in this collection, The Shape of a Pocket. And in that exchange of letters, you see the steps that occur in this process of collaboration, this step by which the subject's body falls away and the artist is overtaken by the experience of collaboration. And another curious feeling and story that unfolds in that story is also the account of the place of the studio. The place of the studio, of course, is something that's almost disappeared in contemporary society and has become the subject of a great deal of romantic critique and hagiography, etc. But what's interesting in Berger's and Leon Kossuth's and a number of other essays that Berger has written about artists is the way in which the studio is often seen as a very banal kind of productive zone. In that essay, they talk about the studio as a kind of stomach place, a place for digestion, transformation, and excretion. In his essay on Brancusi, he talks about it like as if it was a bakery where you make things. But in each place, they're talking about it as the work that it's a place where work happens, but it also induces this feeling of well-being. Now, I will talk a little bit more towards the end about this feeling of well-being and where it comes from, and how this feeling of well-being is also related to this ability and, in a sense, this freedom to create a world. How the studio and art making itself is a place where you can create the world anew and you can arrange things in a certain kind of order so that that sense of well-being is critical. Now, I will also suggest later that this notion of arrangement is critical to our understanding of the world itself. Because underlying everything I'm saying is the term cosmos. Cosmos, of course, is the ancient Greek word for the world as a whole. It also refers to the notion of a people and our connection with others. To be part of a cosmos is to be part of the world. It's also to be part of a group of people, the humanity. But cosmos also refers to the principle of arrangement. Hence we have the term cosmetic. Arrangement, creating order, is fundamentally a banal thing like the way in which you arrange things in your office, the way in which you decorate your flat, the way in which you order your garden, is to create a place of repose and well-being in which and through which you can construct your sense of how things should be in the world as a whole. Now, that is a bit of a parenthesis, but I believe it's also central to the way in which we understand the process of collaboration and production and creation. And this idea that the artist is a receiver of images and symbols and an arranger of things that come to them. In that sense, Berger stresses in his exchange with Kossuth that the artist is like a good host. Of course, this term host takes us in two directions. One is the principle of hospitality, the reception of the others, and the other is the principle that's also contained in the concept of hospitality, in your own autonomy. Now, the good host does not abandon himself and relinquish all his values in their reception of others. And similarly, what is curious about the artist, the stories that Berger traces in artists, is that even when he is emphasizing this collaborative dynamic, this interaction, this oscillation, this interplay with others, what is interesting is the emergence of an understanding also of a persistence in thematic or methodological or procedural approach. That a kind of continuous subject is slowly and unfolding from one work to the other. A recurrence, a reiteration, a struggle to get it right again and again, and a repetitive urge to articulate something that's coming out of a core principle or core process or core understanding, but is implicit in everything that this artist is doing. It's like fingerprints, at one point he says. And throughout Berger's writing, he's trying to understand what it is about each artist's work that has, and what this quality that appears in each artist's work. At one point he says, every convincing painting makes a spatial system of its own. This appears very early on in a collection of essays called About Looking. And it repeats, this principle can in a sense is repeated throughout all of his criticism, where he talks about place, and place as an active zone, as a place where something imperceptible is being articulated, but also as an organizing principle. Place is a kind of ambient principle that's everywhere but can't be precisely located. And he talks about this in a very complex way, again in this collection, The Shape of a Pocket. And I'll read this passage when he's referring to another Spanish artist who he's had many exchanges with, Miguel Bargello, and he talks about the way in which place is being constituted in the work of art itself. He says, the painter is continually trying to discover, to stumble upon the place which will contain and surround his present act of painting. Ideally, there should be as many places as there are paintings. The trouble is that a painting often fails to become a place. When a place is found, it is somewhere on the frontier between nature and art. It is like a hollow in the sand within which the frontier has been wiped out. The place of the painting begins in this hollow, begins with a practice, with something being done by the hands, and the hands seeking the approval of the eye, until the whole body is involved in the hollow. So this story, this passage, this account of the significance of place, the constitutive force of place in art, I believe is drawing us to focus on both the very specificity of a set of forces that appear, or the references that appear in a painting, and a broader generality, a broader kind of topography that's both inclusive of the perspective of others, so that even though we might not be someone who shares the same coordinates or historical experience as the artist, that we too can project ourselves into that kind of space, so that it becomes a kind of topography that includes others, but also does never relinquish its own specificities. And that is this mercurial kind of process. This attention that appears in the more recent work, and also a kind of attention that's also, I think, central to this beautiful sort of story called Bento's Sketchbook. This attention, again, I would argue, is implicit in the essays that are found in About Looking, but fundamentally different as well. Let me explain. In Bento's Sketchbook, and in what I've just read, there's a sort of attention to the specificity of the sense of place that a storyteller is trying to bestow. But there's also attention to the way in which we learn to identify with the kind of arrangement, the way in which an artist connects things, and that our appreciation of the artwork itself, in a sense, becomes a consequence of our capacity to start to follow the way in which the artist has a peculiar kind of habit of arranging things, how they put one thing beside another, why they choose to quote from here and then from there, why they take us from one optic and then into another. So this kind of procedure, this kind of way of arranging things, this kind of storytelling as cosmos, as cosmetic, as making a world, is both an activity that is unique to a particular artist, but one that includes and invites us to take our place in that world and take it for ourselves. This kind of attention was implicit in the way in which John Berger talked about other artists like Millet and Courbet and Ahmed and their own struggles to find a truth in the genre of painting. But I think it's become more conscious when he struggles to himself define the way in which art makes a world and how art is a worldly or worldview making practice. What do I mean by this worldliness of art? It's not like globalizing, because by globalizing we often think of how we interconnect the parts to be able to control them, to integrate them, to produce a sense of totality through control. So the parts are integrated together to produce a greater sense of the whole, a more coordinated, more powerful, in a sense, more controlling emphasis on the universe. That is a familiar discourse that every politician and businessman is quite happy to promote under the rubrics and headings of globalization. What I think we're talking about here and under the headings of aesthetics is a worldliness which is open to a process of becoming with the parts, not between the parts, in service of the whole. So it's a becoming open to the whole rather than a controlling of the parts into a new whole. This perspective of the world through arrangement, through openness, is, I think, constitutive of a different kind of worldview, different to the political and economic discourses that are dominating our perspectives on the world as a whole. So in conclusion, let me now stress some of the points that have been at the core of my attempt to account for the shift in John's writing. Like I said at the beginning, the obvious way of reading John Berger's work was to see how he was trying to articulate, to be a spokesperson of the changes that art was intimating, how it could contribute to a transformation of the world towards the pursuit of justice, solidarity, and truth. Now, I think a more obtuse, more obscure, but nevertheless just as real and material kind of perspective is operative in Berger's writing. The political objectives have not changed. However, the attention to the process of creativity has highlighted how our sensory awareness of the world also produces a kind of world in itself, and how that sensory awareness is more complex and more mysterious than we previously had given it credit for. And he himself, Berger, has not been able to define it in a once and for all kind of way. He hasn't been able to say, this is what it is, and these are the steps that we take to get to it. Whenever he makes an account of these changes, he uses kind of ambiguous kind of stories, sometimes about dreams, sometimes about memories, sometimes about illusions or personas that he's seen in a fleeting and ghostly kind of way. And he talks about himself, therefore, as someone who's appeared in a dream, as a dealer of appearances. But the effort in these characters that is articulated through their persona is the effort to get deeper inside things, to rearrange things, to create this cosmos through a decorative and order-giving activity. And in effect, the principle of hospitality is constantly coming back to us through this collaborative practice of receiving signs and making work. Because the function of place, he argues, is to welcome the absent. He says this in a number of places, but the key point that he is stressing is that place is an order-making activity. Now let me conclude by drawing our attention to another passage from a marvelous essay on Degas that also appears in The Shape of a Pocket, where he talks about this order-making activity. And note, I want to highlight the conclusion in that essay, where Bersia finds a kind of harmonic union in Degas between the particular and the universal, and then brings it back to the absolute recognition that a mother has for a child. He says, and he's talking about a painting by Degas, watching the woman standing on one leg and drying her foot. We are happy for what has been recognized and admitted. We feel the existent recalling its own creation before there was any fatigue. And then later on he says, do we not all dream of being known by our backs, legs, buttocks, shoulders, elbows, hair, just nakedly known as a child is by its mother. Now, this point of being known in this precise sense, but being known in a way that becomes central to the whole story of creation, I have argued was implicit in all of John Berger's earlier work. It was certainly implicit in the way he talked about photography as a kind of translucent form of the documentary. It was implicit in the way he talked about the relationship between practice and theory. It was implicit in the way in which he talked about eternity in the world. But I think it's now that it's something that has taken us closer to the way in which art has been seen as a world-making activity, and art as a way of inducing and exuding a sense of well-being. Now, I'm highlighting these points, these fundamental categories, not because I want to emphasize a sort of mystical regression, on the contrary, as I said at the beginning, because I want to emphasize the need to rethink categories like the universal. Obviously, the old metaphysics, and certainly the idea of the divine as a point from which the universal originates from, is not what is at stake here. What is at stake, however, is a way of thinking about the universal in a more concrete, in a more down-to-earth, but also in a more subtle and intimate way. It is a way of thinking about how the idea of the universal may help us rethink the way in which we actually belong to this world. Thank you.